tackling tough topics to help you think reasonably about life's most important issues. This is Thinker Sensitive.
You're listening to the Thinker Sensitive podcast. This is Chad Graham, and I'm here today with Dr. Paul Gould to discuss his new book, Cultural Apologetics, Renewing the Christian Voice, Conscience, and Imagination in a Disenchanted World. Paul, thanks for being with us today.
You're welcome. Good to be here, Chad.
Paul, tell us about your new book and what motivated you to write a book on cultural apologetics.
Yeah, that's a great question. So a couple things, really. So we've been working with college students for probably 20 years on the campus and doing campus ministry. And I just realized early on that when we share the gospel, it's not always getting a fair hearing. People aren't interested. I think our culture in large is becoming biblically illiterate. And so what was happening was, I noticed a couple things. I noticed in my evangelism, I always veered towards those who were more intellectual or wanted to have a conversation about the gospel in the context of ideas. And then I also noticed that in the classroom we're losing, like Christianity isn't viewed as truth. And so I've been wrestling with that question for years. And then, fast forward 20 years, I find myself teaching in a seminary, Southwest Seminary in Fort Worth, Texas. And one of the classes I was assigned to teach was cultural apologetics. Okay. And so I did what anybody did. I went and Googled that phrase. And of course, it was like, this was 5 years ago, there's nothing. And so it just started, I basically assigned 7 books that I was interested in that I thought might have something to say about the nexus of culture and evangelism and the gospel, and read those 7 books. And the next semester, I assigned another 7 books. And after a while, after teaching this class 4 or 5 times, I began to realize that it is possible to have a conversation with our culture in such a way that they can actually hear and listen and understand the gospel. And so that's kind of how we got started on the path toward this thing called cultural apologetics.
So this phrase, disenchanted world, even in the title here, might be foreign to some of our listeners. Unpack that a little bit. Tell us what you mean by disenchanted.
Okay, yeah, so it is a word that's, it's interesting. A lot of people are using this language now, and I think it probably goes back to Charles Taylor, and he wrote this mammoth book, which is like 900 pages. So if you want to try to read it, good luck. It's called The Secular Age. There's also Jamie K.A. Smith wrote a summary or a kind of commentary on that book called How Not to Be Secular, Understanding Charles Taylor, and that's a great entree into this. But in there, he talked a lot about this idea that we live in a disenchanted world. And so Taylor's idea, he talks about secularism, and what he means by that is we live in an age of contested belief, where unbelief is possible and even belief is difficult for us. I'm using the term disenchanted, though, to describe a way of perceiving. So it's actually a way of perception. And what I mean by that is that we live in a culture today that no longer sees reality in its proper light. So we just don't see the world. We use language like mundane or everyday or ordinary. Mm-hmm. But in reality, the world is sacred, to use C.S. Lewis's favorite word. It's enchanted. It's mysterious. It's beautiful. It's creation. It's gift. And so that's the sense of the word that I am using when I talk about the fact that we live in a disenchanted world.
So when you talk about also renewing the Christian voice, what does that mean in the context of your book?
Yeah, and so it's just the observation that, so for example, if you were walking around at Colorado State University and you saw a sign that said, "Come hear what Zeus has to say about the nature of human persons," or you saw another sign and it said, "The Flat Earth Society is going to tell you about the nature of physics and the world." My guess is you probably wouldn't, well, maybe you'd be interested because it's kind of weird, but you wouldn't be interested in actually going to those events because you're going to learn something that's true.
Not in a way that's useful, right?
Exactly, yeah. And it's because it's just not plausible that Zeus has much to say in actuality about the nature of human persons, or that the Flat Earth Society has much to say about the nature of physics. And in the same way today, when we would, so to switch the analogy, suppose that you walked in the campus and you saw a sign, "Come hear what Jesus has to say about the nature of the soul." Well, in the same way that it sounds implausible for us to hear what the Flat Earth Society has to say about our world, well, to many in our world, it sounds implausible. We don't care what Jesus has to say because he doesn't have anything to say when it comes to matters of reality. And so that's what I mean when I say we've lost our Christian voice. We live in a culture because of, well, atheism and now new atheism and then new atheism. We live in this culture where belief in God we're told, is irrational, or we're told it's a delusion, or that it's destructive or dangerous in some way. And so it's just not viewed as plausible. And so that's what I'm concerned with, is we want to help people at least give Christianity a fair hearing. I mean, it's the Holy Spirit's job to convict them of their sin and to open their eyes to the truth of it. But we want to join with God in helping the soil be somewhat, viable, so that people can even consider it as possibly true.
So you also talk about in the book renewing a Christian conscience. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so the idea is that not only have we lost our Christian voice, I think, today in a disenchanted world, but we've lost the Christian conscience. And so if you think about it, historically, the church, our role is a prophetic role. We are called by God to speak light into darkness, to be salt into a corrosive and decaying world. But because of the fact that we, as Christians, often are just as fragmented now, today, as our neighbors, because we read of Christian leaders and ministry leaders disqualifying themselves daily or weekly, because we're confused about our role in society, nobody thinks that the church has much to say when it comes to morality. In fact, just like the truth claims are implausible, well, the moral claims of Christianity are implausible and undesirable. And so now the traditional views on sexuality or marriage or, go down the list are just viewed as not only implausible, but undesirable and repressive. Who would want to do that? And so that's the challenge that we have in our disenchanted age.
You also call Christians to develop a deep sense of the imagination. What is the state of Christian imagination today in the American church, and what are you calling Christians to?
Yeah. Again, I think that Taylor has been instrumental in sort of helping the church. He talks about the social imaginary, and then Jamie K. Smith in a lot of his writings, Desiring the Kingdom, Imagining the Kingdom, Awaiting the King. A lot of his writings have also, I think, brought this issue to prominence. And it's just the idea that we're not merely thinking heads. We do have minds, and I don't want to. That is important. We are rational animals, but we're more than that. We're desiring animals. We're imaginative animals. And so the point is that we inhabit a world and a worldview at the level of our bones, at the level of our imagination. So we all narrate our lives according to a story. But unfortunately, because a lot of times Christians today, so disenchantment affects everybody. It affects those outside the church, but it also affects us within the church. Mm-hmm. And so as a corollary of that, a lot of times as Christians, we struggle with the gospel story as really being a story that animates our life. And so we no longer carry and embody the Christian story as the thing that narrates and gives meaning and identity to our lives. And so we've lost the Christian imagination. And so what we need to do here is to re-enchant that too, and to begin to see the gospel story as the best story. In fact, Alvin Plantinga, you might probably know this, he wrote an article years ago, and it shows up in his most recent book too, where he talks about how the Christian story is not just the best story. The gospel isn't just the best story. It's actually the best possible story, because the best possible stories are stories that have incarnation and atonement. And that's the gospel. We have this incredible story, yet we too, like Christians, are living secular narratives and finding our joy in things that are just ultimately not satisfying and not alive.
So this book seems very informative, but also equipping. What are you hoping that readers learn to do as a result of this book?
Yeah, so in the book, I'm making the case that it's not business as usual, I think, in the church and in our culture. In fact, so let me just back up. Philip Reif, who's a sociologist, he wrote a book called My Life Among the Deathworks, where he talks about there's basically three cultures that have existed throughout history: first culture, second culture, third culture. And first cultures and second cultures always understood the natural world and the social order as a reflection of the sacred order. So first cultures were your pagan cultures, second cultures were your monotheistic religious cultures. But he says we live in a third culture world today. And he says this is something unique. This is something new. We've never seen third culture in the history of the world. Third cultures have severed the cord between the sacred order and the social order. And so part of my job in the book is to say, look, things are not business as usual. Disenchantment has changed everything. And so I want to give people a vision for a gospel story that's alive and understands us, and for Jesus, who is ultimately the only person that gives us true hope, true meaning, true wholeness, true forgiveness of sin. And then to invite others to join with God in the story of the gospel to re-enchant the world. So yeah, it's practical. I believe, and this is a hopeful part of the book, I believe that we can join with the Holy Spirit because of God's intentions for the world and his love of humans. I believe that we can join with the Holy Spirit to play a role in re-enchanting the world so that the gospel will be viewed as both reasonable and desirable.
Dr. Paul Gould, thanks for being with us today. Again, his book title is Cultural Apologetics, Renewing the Christian Voice, Conscience, and Imagination in a Disenchanted World. It's not out yet, but you can pre-order like I did on Amazon today, so please go ahead and do that. This is going to be a fantastic book. Can't wait to read it. Paul, thanks again for being on the show.
You're welcome.
If you want to hear more interviews and podcasts, please visit thinkersensitive.com. We just released our season on socialism, so take a look at that, and we look forward to being with you soon.
For more Thinker Sensitive content, visit thinkersensitive.com.